All right, so I think that we are online. Hello, everyone online. Hello, everyone offline. So we are now moving to our second keynote talk by, and I will pronounce using the Polish version. So Benjamin Purzycki. We just had a conversation about like the correct pronunciation, so that might be the best. And Benjamin will be talking about morality and the gods, rethinking the role of cognition and culture. Let me just say that Ben is an anthropologist who engages in cognitive, evolutionary, ethnographic sciences of sociality and cultural variation. And his general topic of interest is mostly religion. He studies when, why, and how religious beliefs and ritual behaviors correspond to local problems, and whether or not religion mitigates those problems' effects. He has conducted field work in the Thai Republic to address these concerns and also managed large cross-cultural studies, as we can also read on his official page. So, without further ado, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Yeah, it's really nice to be in a country that knows how to pronounce my name, but also be introduced by organizers who asked me how to pronounce it before introducing me. So that just tells you about the wonderful level of humility that the organizers have. But also, I wanted to express genuine appreciation for how much effort this is, because this is a lot of work. So the people who've been organizing this, it's a real treat to be able to do this and to get shuttled around without having to worry too much about the practical things. That said, the talk today is going to be about this relationship between morality and religion. And I'll definitely deliver on that part, but this idea of rethinking the role of cognition and culture, I might not deliver as much on that front. Because it's a topic that I've been obsessed with for quite some time, and when you get obsessed with things, I've learned that it becomes frustrating when you hear other people talk about it. They could be right, they could be wrong. It's just annoying either way. But with particular respect, and everyone in this room probably knows this, is that if you study religion, everyone else is already an expert. It's like pronouncing last names, right? It's like everyone else has a sense of what it's supposed to be. And I'm guilty of it as well. So I'm going to sort of work within that sort of framework of being a sort of self-deprecating researcher in this field who cares about the implications of it. So who cares about this topic? Well, lots of folks do. I think it's supposed to be going forward here. No? Suddenly not working. That's okay. I can do that.
So we have to switch the window. I'm sure we can do it from here, but
It's not working on here.
Myszka na drugi ekran poprosił. Żeby był zaznaczony drugi ekran, wiesz?
Wiesz, to znaczy tu na...
Tak. Teraz powinno.
Oh, now it's working. Okay, great. So what's the relationship between religion and morality? It's obviously a complicated question. If it was a Facebook profile, that's what it would say. It's complicated. But the answers to these questions mask the complexity of the question. So I want to sort of define, I guess, briefly where I come from when it comes to these concepts, and then we can discuss all of the various views that are implied in this discussion, some of which we'll tackle head on. But I tend to think of religion as simply behaviors that are conducted under the auspices of some spiritual agent, whether it's anthropomorphic or a force. It's all good with me. But the emphasis on the behaviors, and then the things that we'll talk about that sort of help define it are these spiritual agents. That said, morality is also a high inference construct. Everyone's got a sense of what it means, and there's very little consistency. The way I tend to think of it is in slightly two different ways. both of which are grounded in evolutionary theory and evolutionary biology. In one sense, the most general sense, morality is a system of norms and behaviors that impose a benefit or a cost on other people. So it's the costs and benefits of social life. So people tend to emically say imposed benefits are good because it's nice when you help me across the street. Imposed costs are bad. It's not nice that you kicked me across the street, right? So that's the emic sort of models of the good and bad, and you can see how this corresponds. Of course, not everyone thinks about it that way, but that's how I tend to think about it. The sort of second version of that is a more specific version, namely we can treat what we call morality as behaviors and practices and values that are associated with human cooperation. I'll just have to stop there, but it'll be clear as we get through what this means. What I'm going to try to do is make the case that if we can stick with these, at this point, relatively intuitive conceptions of religion and morality, we can actually get fairly far establishing this relationship between the two, right? But a lot of the talk, as most of us, if not all, are aware of too, is a huge discussion on the nature of so-called moralistic traditions. What's that mean? It means behaviors and practices devoted towards spiritual agents associated with morality. Some of us, of course, will say, well, that's all of them. Some of us will say, well, that's only a few of them. Some of us have sort of folk ideas. So if we draw from the likes of Dawkins and Hitchens and those four horsemen, people suggest that religion induces immoral behavior. That's the nature of this relationship. I think Dawkins, it's a near quote, but he's discussing the case of fundamentalists forcing other human bodies into a stack of tires and burning it, and saying something along the lines of only religious sentiment could produce a behavior like this. Well, we know that that's silly. Nevertheless, mild, quite popular attitude. And personally, I like on some days I think that way. It's frustrating sometimes as a secular person, specifically when I grew up in the States and saw Jesus everywhere. Until I came here, I was like, well, no, Jesus really is everywhere. Right? There's another nun. It's neat. It's like, where's Waldo? But easier. So that's like, they're folk models about this relationship. And of course, we have to wade through those. I won't dig too far into this. Some of folks in the humanities argue that religion is morality by virtue of morality being a set of oughts rather than ises, right? And I'm sympathetic with that. It gets us like nowhere in terms of if we're trying to come to terms with human relationships and models of morality or moral behavior. This argument, it's not even a thesis. It's a starting point for a set of other operations. Again, I've got no real issue with it other than I think analytically these things do matter when we actually look at it empirically, and we'll get into that. Some from the cognitive science of religion suggest that religion only appears morally relevant by virtue of the way our minds are designed. We can infer that there's some sort of relationship between moral stuff and religious stuff, but that's the limit of it. It's the way it's all in our heads. It doesn't necessarily moderate our behavior. We'll talk a little bit about that. The idea that religion's effects on morality are local, meaning that religion can get us so far in terms of boosting or supporting moral relationships within a community, but not much beyond community. So it's not necessarily helpful for cross-group relationships. Some, as we'll talk about more in depth today, is that some posit that only very specific religious types, of course the Abrahamic traditions, maybe Buddhism, Hinduism, the other big ones, are explicitly associated with morality, and the rest are devoid of moral content. We'll address that point too. So all these different assumptions, and I say that carefully because these are often assumptions used to justify a particular theoretical thesis. They're not always empirically, I mean, they're yet to be reliably empirically instantiated in a lot of ways. So I want to talk about, I'm here to give a keynote, so I'm going to talk about my contribution to this conversation. All right. So what I'm going to talk about I tend to think of reality as a set of nested analytical levels. The thing that academics like doing is that someone gives a talk and then they're talking from a cognitive perspective, and then someone will ask a question about intergroup dynamics. And they could conceivably say, well, I was talking about cognition, not intergroup relationships and so forth. But there's this sort of analytical level hopping. I'm going to do that within this talk. I'm not going to say that one's better than the other, but I will be arguing at various analytical levels, from the individual level and cognition to beliefs and behaviors to intergroup relationships. I'm going to hop around that, but I can appreciate that, that there are different approaches or levels of analysis that we come to. The thesis I'm going to defend is that religion and morality are inextricably linked cross-culturally, across analytical levels, but we have to know how to examine it. And so, as you might guess, once you examine these things empirically, these kinds of sentiments just don't really hold up because, again, social life is complicated. So that's the subtext here. Right. So, by way of intellectual history, I'm going to situate what I've done within this long tradition addressing this question. And so, we can claim that E.B. Tyler is the titular godfather or progenitor of anthropology, the field of anthropology, and across two magisterial volumes called Primitive Culture, he argued against the prevailing thesis at the time that so-called primitive peoples had no religion. That's where we were in the 1800s. That so-called simpler societies or traditional societies, primitive societies, savages, whatever word you want, were devoid of religion. And over 2 volumes, he did all sorts of stuff in these volumes, but he devoted a lot of these 2 volumes to the animism thesis, namely that all traditions around the world are religious by virtue of their belief in unseen spiritual agents. And he documented copious amounts of cases around the world to make this case. Now, at this point in intellectual history, this should be laughable if someone were to do the same thing. Yet people still maintain particular arguments like this. But aside from all of this, we've got E.B. Tyler sort of changing the scope of how we go about understanding these questions. Now, you can read across these 2 volumes. You might be convinced, yes, traditional populations do have traditions. In about roughly 3 lines across these 2 books, he's like, oh, but there's no relationship with morality. We get that with the Abrahamic traditions that make it so explicit with things like the Golden Rule and the 10 Commandments and all of this stuff. Primitive cultures, they're moral. They have a sense of morality, but they do not have this association between spiritual agency or religion and morality. In just 3 lines. And that kind of expertise is awesome to have if you can get away with it, just to be able to say stuff like that and move on. Well, thankfully, he had a student, Andrew Lang, who's like, no, that's wrong. And he looked at Australian religions and found systematically not hints, but beyond hints, evidence of explicit relationships between morality and their tradition. Namely, their gods functioned as moral models. The kinds of things they got punished for spiritually were about moral things. Very rigorous investigation. So thankfully, we've got renegade students of senior folks who are changing the scope of the conversation. The thing I want to point out here is, given this, when this stuff was going on in our understanding of cultural diversity, neither of these 2 did a day of field work, right? Where they were getting their information was from primarily missionary reports, travelers' reports. I'm going to go out and hang out in Mongolia for a week and see what happens, and then these guys would pore over these documents. Primarily missionary reports, some informal. To call it ethnography is kind of criminal in my view, but it's informal observations. So they argued from the armchair with what the evidence they could have, right? Eventually, of course, we have resistance to sort of armchair approaches to understanding cultural diversity. And field work and embedded field work becomes staple, like long-term field work becomes staple for interrogating this question about the nature of religion. We have two huge figures in the anthropology of religion, Malinowski, maybe? Malinowski and Evans Pritchard, who both did extensive field work and took this relationship between religion and morality amongst the simplest of societies as a given. Malinowski said, I mean, this is a virtual quote, I should just have this on hand because I try to quote it all the time. He said, like, it's so obvious that religion is inextricably linked with moral systems in traditional societies. It's how people regulate each other, it's how they regulate themselves, they make appeals to deities to curb each other's behaviors and engage in ritual behaviors that are wrapped in expectations of interpersonal relationships. People use rituals to deal with intergroup challenges or threats to cooperation. Evans Pritchard, in I think an unfortunately underappreciated little volume, if you haven't read it, please do go get it. It's one of these volumes where he argues against everything but has no central basis. But it's really helpful because he anticipates all kinds of the arguments that we see nowadays. But he's like, ever since fieldwork, we know that morality is inextricably linked with religion. And it was by virtue of fieldwork that people found this out. And he says, and when we present people with this fact, their impulse is systematically, well, they must have learned it from someone else. Right, like the pyramids in South America, they clearly had to learn it from Africans because they're too stupid to be able to figure these things out themselves. He anticipates that and says, all fieldwork evidence suggests that this is just false. This is just a false assumption, right? That was anthropology. Like the biggest shots there were in anthropology of religion in the early mid 1900s. Something happened. One is that as lovely and dedicated as these folks were in terms of long-term fieldwork, when we look at ethnographies these days, it's kind of tough to know what they did because it's actually methodologically weak. Fieldwork is a great alternative to sitting in an office. Well, I prefer sitting in an office, but it's preferable to just pontificating about data collected from other folks. But it wasn't done systematically, so there's like no real method other than being there and trying to do your best to make generalizations about folks. So given the sort of what I might call, if dramatically, the methodological revolution of psychological sciences and cognitive anthropology, we now have standards that are a little higher. So let's see, once the standards get upped when it comes to the cognitive science of religion, what happens? Well, we have a bifurcation, effectively, in the way people have been talking. On the one hand, we have folks like Pascal Boyer, who says, well, religion doesn't make people moral. It doesn't contribute to cooperation. We think it does. Why? Well, because when we have agents that people are talking about that care about you, you infer that they're morally interested in your conduct. Because we all infer that we're morally culpable and concerned agents. So it's sort of, again, this extension of standard intuitions that we have. And the reason why this sort of works in Pascal's view is that it explains this distinction between, of course, Mickey Mouse looks like a religious agent, but he's not, right? Why is Mickey Mouse not a god? Well, because he's not inferred to care about our beliefs. These religious beliefs where we actively infer that these agents are moral agents, they're easy to retain, more compelling, and we're willing to do all sorts of stuff in their name as a result, right? Religion is an evolutionary byproduct. We don't need to go into that. Baring, on the other hand, argues exactly the opposite. Like, we don't even need to have an explicitly cultural representation of moralistic gods in order to induce stuff that we would call moral behavior, right? Like Princess Alice experiments, where kids are playing games, and half of the sample are told that a princess lives in the building. It's a ghost. It's okay, don't be scared. There's a ghost. And then when they're blindfolded, then they're taught to throw balls over their back, and there's a target where it's Velcroed on there. Kids who are in that condition are less likely to cheat, whereas kids who are just told, yeah, go play this game, they're more likely to take their blindfold off and run up to the target and it's an impossible task, right? So this idea is like there's an instinctual relationship between moral behavior and supernatural agency. And of course, Bering was involved in the cultivation of what's now called the supernatural punishment hypothesis, namely that we have like the fear of God as an adaptation to avoid the costs of engaging in what we might call immoral behavior or uncooperative behavior. Bifurcation in the field. Across these influences, these are just two folks. Been a big discussion, of course, about the byproduct versus the adaptivist position. My point here is that in the field, discussing an age-old question about the relationship between religion and morality, we have two diametrically opposed views, right? So what happens? Well, I grew up on this stuff. I'm an old man now. But I mean, I still love this stuff, but it drives me crazy. For a host of reasons. I still love it, but it drives me crazy. It's like your children. You're like, you kind of suck, but you're all we have, right? And so I wanted to add to the conversation in my own sort of bizarre, eccentric way and try to get the best of all these worlds. Again, all of this has influenced all my work. I just don't know if it's a matter of being correct or incorrect, because as far as I can tell, the work thus far avoids more basic questions, but it also is not entirely clear to me that the evidence that they propose actually support the theories that are inspiring them. So I'm going to hint at theories. Really, I'm going to address sort of in the spirit of Will's wonderful talk. I think there are more basic questions that we need to figure out first, and then we can update our theories accordingly. All right. So across a couple papers, again, massively influenced by the cultural evolution and cognitive science of religion. My early work during my PhD program, I went out to the field and I was like, you know what? No one's just asked a so-called primitive society, does your God care about stealing or murder or being helpful to old people? All of these things that everyone would consider moral. No one had actually done it. And so I said, well, how do I do this? Well, I go to Siberia and I ask Southern Siberians who engage in shamanism and animism. And I asked them a battery of questions, one of which was, please list all of the things that this God gets angry with. Please list all of the things that the spirits here are happy with. What are they angered by? They're angered by sullying the resource that they're in charge of, right? I can embrace my Abrahamic biases and say, that's not moral. That's eco-friendly stuff, sure, but it's not moral, right? Which is fine, right? But I also asked them a battery of questions, much like some of the presentations earlier, sort of a factor design, designing scales to measure the degree to which individuals think that their gods care about morality. And found that when you ask someone, does your God care about murder? They're like, oh yeah. Oh yeah. It's like, are you an idiot? Like, of course they do, right? And so we have this, I don't want to necessarily go there, but you can sort of appreciate two different phenomena at work here, namely explicit representations about individuals' relationships, behavioral relationships with deities, and then post hoc biased responses about very targeted things, right? So I did this once and I was like, that was weird. And it was in the first volume of Religion, Brain, and Behavior. I followed it up with another sample just because I was kind of skeptical about all of it. Compared it to American Christians, found the same thing. I was like, wow, that's neat, right? And so drawing from this in a subsequent or concurrent project that measured response times, or response speeds to how people answer questions about what God knows and cares about. So you have Bible-believing Christians who say God knows everything, and yet they're really quick to answer the question that God knows immoral stuff than non-moral stuff. So the setup is like, hear this recording. Does God know that Seth has 12 pickles in his fridge? And I'm like, yes. Does God know that Seth kicks old ladies across the street? Yes. Right? There's like very sharp responses, right? This led me to think that, well, yes, we can talk about theological inconsistency or incorrectness, but to me it was interesting because people seem to have a bias towards associating deities that are important to their religious lives with morality, with no effort. The Christian example, you could always say, well, it's a moralistic tradition and God clearly cares about morality, so that's driving the biases. It's not what I found in the Tuber Republic. Right? So maybe it's just easy for people to think about their deities as associated with morality. Well, it's clear that this is inconsistent, in my view. This is inconsistent, clearly inconsistent with sentiments like lawlessness. Primitive cultures are devoid of morality. Here's an instance where someone systematically measured it, finds a relationship between morality and a so-called simple society. Right, and yet at the same time I was doing this work, there was a curious consensus developing in the field, turning Evans Pritchard sentiments on its head, saying stuff we're all familiar with. Hunter-gatherer societies, there's no ethical implication in religion. Most ancient traditions are unencumbered with moral conscience and uninterested in human morality. The gods of hunter-gatherers are weak, whimsical, and not morally concerned. And this is when I read people, again, I love, and I respect their work, and it inspired me. I'm like, no, not quite. But who am I? I'm just a PhD student going to Siberia to answer fundamental questions about this. Right? So this is the kind of thing that the curious consensus is developing. Well, why this curious consensus developed can be answered in a couple different ways. I'll take the less cynical sociological route and answer the question, like, one of the primary sources, I think, that have influenced this consensus view comes from new methods, namely cross-cultural databases. And so the cultivation of these marvelous resources of cross-cultural databases where we take qualitative data, code it into quantitative stuff, and examine this relationship between whether societies have a moralistic God or a moralistic high God and social complexity, finds time and time again, well, if you use a particular resource, namely the standard cross-cultural sample, if you use the standard cross-cultural sample, which is a prefabricated data set with one religion variable, if you use that resource, you find, and these are all the red hints, that indeed there's a positive relationship between social complexity and the presence of the moralistic high God. And that's, folks cite these papers all the time in order to establish this point. These are all the red things. You can see, it's hard to see, but these green things, over the previous years, when people go out and collect new systematic quantitative evidence at the individual level, those examples all find that traditional societies have gods that care about morality. So here we have a methodological distinction between active fieldwork, these problems that anthropology was supposed to resolve a while ago, and finding that it turns out not to be the case, right? So I don't want to poo-poo databases. I don't want to poo-poo the utility of them. We have to be careful about how we're drawing from this. I'll talk a little bit about it. So the previous work that we've been doing, sort of real critical engagement with these materials. We like using them, but we have to be skeptical of our tools. Like, I like colleagues who are not methodological fetishists. So we don't want to rely too heavily on one method. We want to and beat them to hell, really. So we've been reassessing or interrogating this data set in order to find what the issue is. Like, what's the distinction between why we find it with field work and why we don't find it with these ethnographic databases. So I want to highlight, go to Olivier's talk, it's tomorrow. There you Yeah, just go to Olivier's talk. I'm not going to scoop his hard work, but I will make some highlights. Is that, of course, when you look at the actual data that these databases come from, a lot of them come from the very sources that E.B. Tyler used, missionary reports. So they're sort of sketchy. Like these people don't have even religion. They don't have moralistic deities. And it turns out that it's a missionary who's been sent there to turn them into Christians, right? We have odd operationalizations. This data typically is prefab. It's coded as moralistic high gods rather than just gods that care about morality. We don't know how Murdoch, the guy who created it, coded these things. We just have data, we have the sources, and we don't know how it came from the qualitative reports to the actual hard codes. Lots of weak analyses. If you remind me about it, I can show you some stuff at the end about how these things have done, but Olivia's going to talk about stuff in more detail. But I do want to point out that if you look at all the resources in the standard cross-cultural sample and compare that to the development of anthropological thought and experience, we have the probability that a resource has an instance of a moralistic high god in this record, right? And so this is time, through time. We have Tyler writing the Primitive Culture 2-volume set, saying, yeah, there's no relationship between morality and social complexity. There is a relationship. Small-scale societies don't have it. Here's Evans Pritchard. Virtually every source at that point, when Evans Pritchard wrote his book, systematically had instances of moralistic high gods. I don't want to be too, this suggests that intellectual history and actual work play a huge role in our knowledge of the world. Big surprise there. But one thing I do want to point out is like this could be completely confounded with the spread of Islam and Christianity. Like we can still say like these things are happening at the same time. The spread of fieldwork and direct interaction with other people and missionization. So thanks, history. So this idea of like how people think about the minds of gods that I worked on to try to address this question. People tend to reason about their gods as though they are moralistic. They might not be part of their freely listed or free associated models or cultural models of what gods care about, but they easily reason about it. And researchers in the field have subsequently replicated and found it, and of course made excited sentiment or expressed excited sentiments about finding this fact given the consensus. Maybe the tide's turning, I'm not sure. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on this. But I took the original study and I replicated it across 15 different field sites. And again, just asked people, does this God care about theft? Does this God care about murder? Does this God care about deceit? And asked these individuals across 15 field sites about their so-called moralistic God and a God called a local God, which was predetermined and pre-established to be less explicitly moralistic, less punitive, and less knowledgeable than the so-called moralistic God. And even after holding constant the correlation between moralistic God responses and local God responses, individuals systematically associated their local deities, their traditional deities, as being concerned with and caring about human morality. The exceptions, as we see, are explained by the fact that in these contexts, it's either illegal or socially tabooed by virtue of the dominant Christian tradition to engage with these spirits. So you ask someone, do the Nam in Mauritius care about human morality? And you're like, oh, stuff's black magic. Right? Other folks, it's illegal to engage in practices that are associated with the Nam in Mauritius. We have other cases amongst the Turkana who are hyper evangelized Christians, really aren't allowed to talk about their ancestor spirits. So imagine going from a transition, pre-contact, where you're like, your grandfather doesn't like what you're doing, and the spirit's going to come back and punish you for treating your next door neighbor with disrespect. Going from that to your grandfather is a demon now, and if you engage in practices devoted to him, you're engaging in devil worship. That's these contexts. So we have cultural context accounting for the exceptions. And I want to point out too that these exceptions and the interpretation of these exceptions is consistent with the kinds of data that we got across Tyler's book, okay? And the sources that populate these cross-cultural databases. Right. So in keeping with this distinction between how people might reason about their spiritual agents versus what they're culturally postulated or specific, just one assumption is like, well, like these not an assumption, but one question is like maybe these are just two different levels of cognition. Some of the great work that Thijs van Dixon has been doing found this, that if we look at freely listed associations between what people say their gods care about and answering these direct scales, there's no correlation. Meaning the degree to which people say, for does your God care about murder is inconsistent with whether or not people freely list murder and morality in general. One interpretation of it might be just two different psychological processes. There's a mind dump free list versus actually thinking through the questions. So it might be just people are drawing from two different cognitive resources in order to address the question. Okay. Now, if we look at the relationship between beliefs and behaviors, the story gets even more complicated. So, okay, maybe gods are moralistic, at least at the cognitive level. What's it got to do with moral behavior? Well, across multiple sources, we've addressed this question cross-culturally across two different experimental game frameworks with multiple specifications of those games across 15 societies. We've modeled the hell out of this data and tried to really find where where the weakness is in our conclusions, and we keep finding that when people say their gods know stuff, and when people say that their gods punish them, they are more inclined to behave cooperatively towards anonymous people, quite often in distant communities that they'll never have reciprocal transactions with. Suggesting that when people think that their gods are going to punish them and they know what they've been doing, Santa Claus is watching you, right? They're more likely to engage in behavior that we would, at least again, proximately call more cooperative, more generally call more moral, perhaps, if we want to spin it that way, right? The curious thing about this work is that we've also tried to figure out where this explicit belief comes into play, or whether or not this scale or reasoning about God's minds comes into play in force of behavior. One of Thijs's chapters in his dissertation is trying to beat the hell out of this question. And we found that what gods care about across scales, across free lists, across two different game paradigms, across multiple specifications of those game paradigms, across 15 field sites, overall, nothing. No relationship between what gods. Some cases we find positive evidence. Some cases, I think it was one or two, found negative relationships. So the more a god cares about morality, the less moral they were. There's no clear systematic relationship between the moralistic part of moralistic supernatural punishment and engaging in behavior that is consistent with those beliefs. Why not? Well, we might just be thinking about the content of what gods care about in the wrong way. So here's my modest contribution to rethinking the role that gods play in human societies. And this idea is not original to me, but I'm trying to work through it and see how it fares empirically. Think of someone like Bill Irons or Lee Cronk, more contemporarily, Manveer Singh and Leo Fatucci, just sort of reframing religious beliefs and the content of what gods care about, not as things that motivate people, but rather their appeals to influence other people, right? So while punishment and omniscience might induce behavior that approximates to moral, when you say, well, God doesn't like it if you snore during my lecture, that's not going to motivate me to change my behavior. It's appealing to God to change your behavior. anecdotally, I had a professor when I was a PhD student. When I used to smoke cigarettes, I was sitting outside smoking a cigarette, and he said, God knows that you're smoking. And I said, yeah, but he doesn't care. Right? That's exactly the theory I'm working with, is that he might know, he might even care, but it's not going to change my behavior. It might be useful to influence others' behavior. So drawing from this idea that beliefs, or this aspect of beliefs, are not motivators, but rather appeals to engineer moral behavior, engineer cooperative behavior. We've been examining this as well. So we've been running through this idea in a couple different ways. One was experimental. So I worked with Joni Sasaki and Nick Stagnero to design an experiment. We had a lot of fun with it. But we use the free list method, list all the things that make God angry, and people list these things. But instead of using this to predict behavior, we use behavior to predict change in the structure and content of beliefs. Not nearly as clever as Peter over here has been doing, but it was a start. But in our modest study, we got a group of Christians on Prolific or Enter, one of these things. Got them in a virtual lab, and they played a trust game. The trust game is as follows: they sit down in the lab session, and they say, "We're going to give you $1, and you can either keep that $1, or you can give this $1 to another Christian, and we're going to multiply that $1 by 3." And then that Christian can decide whether or not to keep all the money or send half back to you. So you can risk your money and make a little bit more, or you can just keep it and have a little less money. Well, what we didn't tell them until the very end was that they weren't actually playing with anyone. They were just randomly assigned to a computer. And we took their demographic data, and they're like, I'm 33, so we made sure that it was like a 38-year-old male Christian you're playing with. And so we manipulated the outcome of the game. And for the folks who didn't play the game, what angers God? They had their models. Well, as it turned out that when Christians got ripped off by other Christians in the trust game, they were more likely to associate God's anger with greed. Right? And so it was sort of fun to see the content of Christians' models change as a result of getting up. So this, in my view, is, again, it's a modest step. And thanks to COVID, we couldn't replicate it. But maybe it's a possibility. The idea that the content and structure of people's beliefs can, in one shot, we can see an effect of it shifting, as though religious beliefs were appeals to influence others' behaviors rather than something that's going to necessarily motivate. It doesn't rule out the idea that these beliefs motivate or don't motivate behaviors, but that does. So if we roll with it, at least the appeals and the content of appeals can adjust themselves to novel situations. That's the take-home message here. Now, given this kind of work, again, I'm going to keep drawing attention to Tyus's PhD work here. What we did with part of the cross-cultural project is we collected this free list data about what people say their gods care about, examine this possibility that maybe these appeals are actually appeals to particular problems. They point to God's care about behaviors that engage in or stimulate or contribute to increasing the likelihood that people have cooperative relationships, whether it's the likelihood that they cooperate or play or engage in rituals that contribute to cooperation, or bring people together in such a way that increases the probability that cooperators interact with each other. That's a direct appeal to evolutionary game theory. You can leave that on hold here. But what Tyus did is, like, we had this free list data. Tyus analyzed this data and said, okay, these people say that their local gods care about this stuff. And then he did the ethnographic field work. He didn't go into 8 different cultures, but he went to the library and examined the ethnographic context in which these beliefs existed, and found that they were systematically associated with local threats to cooperation. Right? You don't have to be a functionalist. You should be, but you don't have to be a functionalist. You don't have to be a functionalist to appreciate that if we're going to think of cooperative dilemmas and cooperation as a subset, an important central subset of what we call morality, and these appeals are associated with behaviors that can directly contribute to real social dilemmas, modelable social dilemmas that people face cross-culturally, the implication being is like maybe religion does evolve, aspects of religion does evolve to address these problems, not just in association with these problems, but potentially to resolve these problems. This project doesn't demonstrate that, but this project does demonstrate that the content of people's beliefs cross-culturally will point to threats to cooperation, real or ersatz, which we can talk about a little bit too. But these are framed, these can be framed in game theoretical terms. Set that aside for now. So where are we? Great, this is the last slide, I think. So where are we? So I took you on a tour, we hopped around cognition, group level phenomena, intergroup relationships. There's some outstanding tasks for me as someone who's obsessed with this question, but also for the field. And part of it's just a cry or a plea for clarity. But as it turns out, I think there are problems with the way contemporary theories are expressed that this work suggests we need to think a bit harder about. Theoretically, we really do need some appreciation, I think, from at least within the cultural evolutionary field, is why this matters, why cognition versus like reasoning about what gods care about versus the explicit beliefs. Why does it matter in the grand scheme of things? Of course, aspects or parts of supernatural punishment hypothesis posit that the moralistic component is going to also induce cooperation above and beyond, gods that care about maybe ritual and so forth. But it doesn't specify whether or not, like how do we measure that? But it's a theoretical problem in the sense that the theories do not say whether or not reasoning is going to induce this behavior or explicit beliefs are going to induce behavior. I've gotten feedback from reviewers for the same paper arguing completely opposite perspectives. Right? We've all had that experience, but you get someone who's a psychologist says psychology is known forever that explicit cultural models don't do anything. And you get a person saying, well, we all know that cultural models do stuff and reasoning is just a mechanism at work. Like, I hate you all. Sorry if you're any of my reviewers were here. Right. Right. But I love this distinction, whether it's type 1, type 2, implicit versus explicit, all this stuff is fun. But the theories in terms of examining this relationship do not make it clear what matters. So I would like to be told what matters. This distinction, of course, between analytical levels of individuals versus group level versus intergroup. So part of the Evolution of Religion and Morality project, like we had field researchers who went out there and collected data from individuals, and we did it as best we could and systematically and so forth. And then we found that there's a relationship between people's beliefs in supernatural punishment and cooperation. And it's cool to see that stuff happen. And then you see a paper that might look at group level data. And it's like, here's Latvia, here's Russia, here's this. And it's not cultivated from individual level data, or it's just an average. And finding inconsistent relationships. You're like, well, we're talking about individuals here, not necessarily group level. And so if you can appreciate that there's an analytical distinction, theory also doesn't necessarily specify that either. So folks who use these historical databases, it's a composition fallacy really, but to say, well, these small scale societies don't have moralistic gods. Like, what is 20% of the sample doesn't, or does, or like we don't know, right? So we have to attend to the particular levels, and the theories are I would say, are not helpful with them. I think a lot of the fights that result in the field partially stem from that. Again, we talked about this distinction between motivations and appeals. I think that the distinction might be psychologically real, but But again, the theories are not necessarily speaking to that too. I only have 13 minutes, is that? Should I whiz through it?
Well, there is still 40 minutes for everything, including discussions.
Okay, you said 40?
Together with discussion.
Fantastic. I'll slow down. All right. So there's lots of other theoretical issues that we can address too, and I think like these are the ones that are on my mind, and I'd really like to work through. But maybe there are answers that I've overlooked. I'm willing to admit that. Methodological issues we also run into that are similar to the theoretical ones. Is like one, like for the evolution, religion, and morality project, where we did cross-cultural data collection at the individual level. We use the same method everywhere, right? And I think it's important. It was appropriate for this question. But at the same time, we know that there's cultural diversity, right? So it's like the question earlier about essentialism. The question is not necessarily like, do people not essentialize? It's like, how do they do it if they do it, right? And that's tough. Like that's a methodological challenge, and it's a real challenge. But I will say, and this is another, like, I have a reputation for complaining, and this is another one for you, is that I've done stuff in the Tuva Republic, and I was like, well, yeah, at conference meetings, I'm like, I didn't find that in my field site. And the researcher was a psychologist, and they said, I don't know anything about Siberia. I was like, why do I have to contextualize my results? You got to contextualize yours too. I mean, like, it's still this kind of, I think that's the worst weird problem. It's not a sampling issue. It's like, we got to contextualize everything, right? We don't even have to be like hyper blank slatist to appreciate it. We still got to contextualize everything, right? So I think that's an important challenge in the field too. And this isn't sour grapes. Like, honestly, it'll sound like it because I like that. But when you do field work, I mean, if you answer an important question in the field, if you're out there in Mongolia, like psychologists don't necessarily care as much, right? As opposed to lab studies, being full well aware of the sampling problems and so forth, right? Because who wants to learn 2 pages of dense material on the context before they get to the study, right? It's tough. And I think it's a little unfair to editorialize. I think it's a little unfair to expect psychologists to become anthropologists. But I think anthropologists should be better methodologists, so maybe we can meet in the middle. I'm trained in anthropology, so like, give a presentation like this at the American Anthropological Association. It's like, great, burned at the stake. And of course, evidence is always an issue, but this gulf between theory and the actual evidence speaking to it, it's a constant nagging problem. And in the social sciences, it's really tough. But I think we need to be a bit more modest in terms of what our results actually speak to. This was a little out of whack. I can skip through it. In terms of the type of evidence that we use to answer this question about the relationship between morality and religion, how should we weigh? This is sort of a meta science or meta theoretical question, but how do we weigh data or results that are stemmed from individual level versus the group level? Are they on equal footing? Of course, they should follow from the hypotheses that we're testing, but we have very limited resources. We try to do the best we can. If we don't find a relationship with at the group level, but we find it at the individual level, how are you going to come to terms with that? We fight out at the train station, I think, is what the solution has been. So that's an issue. Like, we have to come to terms with that. The other thing we have to come to terms with is the way data come to us, right? We have actual people. What do you believe? God doesn't like immoral behavior, versus what I would call nth order gossip, which is a lot of the kinds of data that come to us about the ethnographic world from missionaries or dilettantes who had a lot of money and just like, oh, go through Mongolia and say, wow, I couldn't see any indication of religion there. They had no religion, zero. Right? I call this nth order gossip because there are all sorts of filtering processes that go through, that this data have to go through in order to come to us. What's more reliable? But this stuff is also historically contingent. So it might be the case that in some contexts, people will say their traditional spirits care about morality because of influence from the Abrahamic traditions or the local imperial religions. But there's no reason to a priori presuppose that it won't go the other way around, or that local spirits, traditional spirits, are no longer moralistic because a big bearded one showed up one day and he's the one that really cares about morality. So you can just sort of offset that. We find that in hagiolatry, right? Saint worship, right? Where that saint over there is interested in like boils, and that one's over there is interested in herpes or whatever, right? They specialize and they diversify, right? So that might be a case that we have to appreciate the historical contingencies as well. And finally, and this goes back to the theory, is that if any of our interests are about explaining religion, whether it's evolutionarily cognitive, we have to appreciate that like social life, of course, is complex, and to come up with a causal models before we embrace the data, we can glean a lot more from the processes that brought data to our eyes in order to analyze it. And so that's a way to both historically and methodologically, but also theoretically, focus in on what our central questions are. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for this fascinating and feisty
Whiny, I think.
So I wonder how can we do it? Maybe it will be best if you could, for example, like sit down, and we could also have our people with questions also sit next to you, and I will just slightly adjust the camera because, like with all online talks, sorry if I'm not very polite. I try my best. And if anyone has questions, then. And if anyone has questions, we will be just asking you to come forward here. I'll give you a chair also. And we'll be also having maybe some questions online, so we'll be probably doing it like one question offline, one question online. So.
No, I want to sit in the middle.
Well, traditionally.
Yeah. Be like a parlor.
Yeah. Ben, I hate you. Basically, you're messing with my mind. A lot of things that I was assuming were settled questions. I see are not settled questions, and this requires me to do a lot of thinking. So I hate you. All right, but more seriously, right? A couple of things that I wanted to pick up on. First of all, with regards to Boyer, right? I mean, his line that there's no such thing as religion.
Yes.
Is tied in with his view that, different kinds of religion, we can talk about it
Right.
that way, completely inconsistently for the moment, have very different relationship to morality.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm wondering, do you think there is such a thing as religion?
Yes.
Uh-huh. You want to say more about that?
Oh, I defined it. So, like, it's a theoretical definition. So, and I'm a humble social scientist. So, knowing that, like, if you define it, any of these constructs slightly differently, we might find different things.
Yeah.
The problem I have with denying or suggesting that religion didn't appear until writing, for example, which is something that Pascal and Dan Sperber have expressed explicitly. I have a difficulty with that because it's like saying that traditional peoples don't have art until they have some component that's required of a society that isn't acquired paper yet. Right? So I think it's actually a commonsensical argument, but it's a little unfair. And at the end of the day, they say, yeah, it doesn't exist, and maybe if it does, anything worth worrying about, it's when it's formalized. I think the deeper question that you're pointing to is more worrisome for it should be more worrisome for everyone, which is that religion is not some kind of ontologically distinct phenomenon in the world. So like separating economy from if that's the motivation behind this sentiment, I think that's fine, but I mean, it is a troubling thing, and I wouldn't presume, I think, to say that it's an isolated component of the lives of all people. It's not just going to church on Sunday. It's but rather it doesn't really bother me so much in terms of my research, because if it's got a God involved. And it's got a behavior associated with that God, it counts. That's just Tyler. And that's the anthropological tradition right there. It counts. Call it something else, that's fine. But do I think, so like in my head, the question is, do I think that people engage in behaviors that they are doing with appeals to gods? Yes. We engage in all sorts of rituals that don't involve gods. Is that religion? Not in my theoretical view. Do you want to call it that? Okay, fine, but it's not useful, right? Do we have all sorts of
utility is the main question.
Yeah. Do we have one that's the goal of the theoretical definition is like how far can you get with it? That's given like Field's purchase, I think. But was I going with it? Oh, like the idea that we cognize spiritual agents all the time, or like agent-like things, we have luck and all of these things. Do I call that religion? I don't until there's a behavior associated with it and they're appealing to that. So if that's religion, if that's a satisfying working both theoretical definition and operationalizable definition of it, then yeah, it exists. Yeah. Like, and why not?
All right. Well,
That's
second thing, Evans Pritchard, right? Very few people, especially in CSR, seem to have read him. And I think part of that is because he's often trotted out as this example of, well, we know evolution is irrelevant to these kinds of things. Evans Pritchard has showed it, right? And reading him, and I'm really curious if you had the same reaction, my reaction was, we agree with what he said, either in general or because of the kinds of methodological tools he had available to him at the time.
Yeah. Well, also, I mean, I would say yes, but also theoretical. So if you think about like the sophistication of evolutionary game theory, evolution of cooperation, like how we think about it, how we formalize it, how we talk about it, it's so much more sophisticated, right?
Yep.
And still at that time, it was still very, in some contexts, if you mention evolution, people are thinking that you're unilineal, just like Tyler was, right?
That's exactly
that's a problem, right? That's a problem, right? And so to the extent that, we're all victims of our intellectual milieu, like, I think he was wrong there. But it's also a passive, like Rappaport was wrong on evolution too, right? But there's so much to be learned from his approach, right? And so I do tend to disagree with that particular point, but he was definitely arguing from a perspective that few ought to share at this point, I think. But yeah, no, I like Evans Pritchard because he's an ethnographer par excellence in terms of figuring out how disparate domains of social life work together to create a logic. And it's not obviously in his head, like maybe Levi-Strauss could be criticized on the basis of like, where is this happening? Well, it's in Levi-Strauss's head. It's not obviously in Evans Pritchard's head where this stuff is happening, right? And so that stuff is, I definitely take inspiration there, but this I think is a challenge for formal evolutionary theory right now, cultural evolutionary theory specifically, is people talk about packages, cultural packages, and these things are inherited as packages. That's fine, but there's also like a weird logic to a lot of the packages we have. And I think religion, and this is where we go back to maybe Boyer and Sperber, is that Evans Pritchard showed that there's a system, at least in the cases where he worked, that there's a cultural system. But in terms of cultural evolutionary theory, like formal mathematical theory is just now coming to terms with like the logic that's intrinsic to like within the cultural packages that are transmitted across generations, right? So like one thing I would like to go with it, and it's just, you know, life, we're bound by space, time, and resources and everything. But the idea that like part of what makes religion compelling too is that it is grounded in common experience, right? And so I think we mentioned the material insecurity hypothesis before, and think about this. The idea that suddenly people become more religious when like something hits, or like an earthquake happens, or there's, you know, a depression or repression, right? It's interesting that would be the response, right? So we did a paper with a group of economists, Joe Henrik and I worked on this paper, where we found that the more exposure people had to warfare, the more they would gravitate towards religion. I'm not convinced that there's any cultural rule that you're supposed to pick religion over like knitting circles in these circumstances, right? So the attraction there might be there, right? But religion has all like a bundle of features, right? Not just necessarily the benefits that people reap there. It could be something that's like actually grounded in the experience of reality. That's not just, we're not talking about free-floating ideas or behaviors. We're talking about things that make sense. So in my fieldwork, they're herders, they have territorial borders, they sacralize the borders, and they engage in annual rituals that reconfirm those borders. Those beliefs and practices don't make any sense unless you pay attention to the constraints.
But to answer those questions, you have to be working both on the psychological and the sociological level
Yeah.
simultaneoly,
Right.
which is exactly what
That's
Purzycki was saying.
like there. Like you gotta do everything, but it's impossible. So yeah. No,
I
absolutely.
better get out of here so others can ask.
Sorry you hate me. I don't want to.
I'll get over it.
Okay, so next questions. I will just maybe make a small announcement that if you are feeling that the levels of oxygen are going low, like I do, then you can freely open the window in the back. Because I had some complaints from the audience. It's not just me. Will, you had a question.
Oh.
Thanks.
All right. First off, thank you for that. I enjoy a good curmudgeonly, here's what we're doing wrong talk. So once we take into account the problems with theory, methods, and evidence, where it looks like, you know, some of the correlations between societal complexity and gods heavily confounded with data source, things like that. Kind of small scale gods, more moralizing, I'm going to assume. Is there enough left of kind of a big God story to hang a hat on, or is it time to start seriously rethinking things?
Well, yes and no, I guess. In one sense, if we're explaining social complexity, it strikes me as that the experimental evidence that we have, cross-cultural stuff we did, is the most culturally robust, diverse samples, et cetera, et cetera. If it's the case that the moral stuff doesn't work, I don't think that's reason to necessarily ruin big gods theory. And here's why. First off, like we know that like even if there were a relationship between social complexity and moralistic supernatural punishment, moralistic supernatural punishment has to kind of, I mean, everyone says it's co-evolutionary. But at the end of the day, if we have a causal direction there, moralistic supernatural punishment has to come first. Otherwise it can't cause. Right. It's cyclic, yes, it ratchets up, okay, fine. But it's got to be able to be there in order for it to work. My deeper, I guess, problem is actually not actually a problem with big gods theory, but rather if we look at rituals conducted in island communities where there's tons of religious cross-group rituals, right? It's even foragers in Tanzania have rituals. They appeal to ancestor spirits. They explicitly come together with other people who they want to come to terms with some, right? That's social complexity.
Yeah.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
But if we're talking about urban, like if that's really what we're talking about, and I think that's common in the discussion. I don't think that any of the progenitors of the pro-social religion hypothesis we're talking about urbanity, right? But that's kind of data we get, you know what I mean? So I don't think it's devastating to the big gods hypothesis. The idea that big gods are associated with big groups, we might have to rethink what we're talking about big gods. But again, like it turns out that small scale societies have gods that punish you for morality, and that contributes to the likelihood that you're willing to dump money on some anonymous Yahoo in the next village. Like it actually bolsters the idea.
Yeah.
Right. So, but it's at the individual level, right? So if we think about traditions, then it's weird because not in the acronymic sense, but weird in the way we use it. But it would be a little strange to find no relationship there. But if we're actually talking about these beliefs galvanizing psychology, it's an individual level hypothesis.
Yeah, it seems like you might really get some traction of like, all right, let's say most religions are pretty moralizing in terms of what the gods want. And some of them have found cool cultural tricks to just kind of capture that a bit better. And those ones will get abused. So you're starting with a bit more universality in the moralization to begin with, but some of them have good tricks to like ratchet that up.
Yeah, and I don't think it's not a problem with the theory. It might be just a matter of scope. Like it's got to be contextualized a little bit more. I don't think anyone would complain about that. The one sort of curious thing is that across these studies, omniscience turns out to be really what's driving this. So the breadth of what God's coverage is actually matters. That to me bolsters aspects of the big gods hypothesis in an intuitive way, right? Like small scale societies who don't necessarily know what's happening downriver, why would their gods know or care about anything that's going on there, right? However, if suddenly there's conflict between the two, then suddenly the god's gonna hate those dudes over there, like right? You see what I mean? So, but the breadth of those gods' knowledge seems to be one of the more sustained and in some model specifications the most robust predictor of widespread cooperation.
That makes sense. Like belief in a moralizing idiot.
Right. No, it's
not a big deal.
Exactly. So like it's an intuitive component, but it's certainly not as sexy as the whole big God story there, because then you have to sacrifice potentially the moral stuff. It might be that, again, like what gods care about might not be part of the story, but omniscience and punishment might.
And it wouldn't be that surprising if there's some cross-cultural regularities in gods and what they care about. Like, it'd almost be weird if they weren't.
Like if so, and it's not. I mean, it's a separate hypothesis, but it's a common one, and it's getting increasingly nuanced. Is the projection hypothesis? Like, God doesn't care about rock and roll. I mean, like I might care about it, but like gods around the world don't really care about this. I think there's like one data point in our data set where someone says like God gets angry when people don't lend me their car, or God really likes people who have cars I can borrow. I mean, that's kind of projection, but it's not systematic, right?
Yeah.
So like the curious thing is, and this is some of Tyus's work here, is like suggesting like there's diversity, but it's pretty constrained around what people got to deal with. Right. So
well, I'll yield the floor. I don't hate you.
So we have another question from the audience, Peter.
What a grand talk. Yeah, so I haven't mentioned Roy Rappaport, but I saw him screaming out there. So obviously, I guess that you've been thinking about his work. Right? That's a starting point. Because what he talks about, there is a lot of, again, signaling going on. And so it's not necessary for people sometimes to be true believers, but if it's extended on an interpersonal level to others, it's a signal of commitment of a whole group of values. So it's not just about like believing in the God, but actually accepting what he represents with a whole set of moral rules, taboos, etc., etc., etc. And it's almost like an extreme example would be, these most absurd conspiracies, and people don't need to believe into them, but they have to signal others that they accept them. So they can be part of the in-group. So is this, am I in my direction? Or
depending on what. Yes, the focus. If we're sharing the same focus on your question, is that I went into the field and people would tell me all the things that you have to do to honor the spirits, all the things that people expected to do, nuanced, subtle behaviors, not so subtle, but all this stuff. Like they knew what they had to do. And people tell me myths and stories about these spirits, and I'm like, do you believe that they're out there? And they go, I don't know. Like it's if you're exposed to American Protestantism, it's weird. But anthropologists have appreciated this for a long time. So Rappaport, absolutely. It's like the key is not beliefs and then the behavior, but rather the thing that needs to still, I think, make sense in the field is why gods? Why not just do a ritual at a border or during some sort of ceremony, and why appeal to the spirits? Does it actually have any force? And then so I look at Rich Sosa's work on the kibbutzim, right? So it wasn't a focus of these studies, but it is bizarre that what defines a religious kibbutz is one that's appealing to gods, and they have longer lasting existence than a secular kibbutz with the same costs, right? But we have lots of potential hypotheses about what God's roles is in all of this, and I think punishment and omniscience are the clearest cases of the things that motivate it. But again, the actual content that people appeal to, it's pointing to a problem that people are facing, I think. But the belief, actual faith, is just not. It's something that I'm always concerned about, but it's just not something that I think needs to necessarily be explained from an anthropological perspective, right? And so I mentioned this question at Will's talk. So Stedman and Palmer make this argument: you just can't tell whether or not people believe. I think that's kind of fair. I don't think it corrupts all the science necessarily, because you can easily just say, well, people's expressions of belief. Well, that immediately bolsters Rappaport's commitments. I mean, I could pick on him a little bit in the sense that he sort of adopted this view that, like a humanist might, for lack of a better sort of cleave. But he's religion is intrinsically moralistic because it's about odds, and I think it's a little easy, but that's because I'm approaching it from a slightly different angle, I think. But he found it to be ubiquitous in the traditions that he's talked about, because as you know, rituals create established liturgies, and you could say, well, this is what we are supposed to do, therefore it's moral. To me, it's more interesting about direct interpersonal relationships. In ritual, I think it's fairly obvious that ritual mediates that. But it's never about whether or not there's no truth value that I think is necessarily matters here. So if you look at variation in a Catholic Mass, for example, just convenient example, I've talked with Hugh Turpin about this, is that you've got a fairly homogenous group of people conveying something. But if someone started speaking in tongues or standing up and doing everything the priest did, you kind of go, well, they're kind of overdoing it, right? So there's a threshold there. Does that person believe more than the next person? I think that's too easy. If you're a real psychologist, I think they're entertaining the same postulates that Christ died for their sins. They're clearly demonstrating their acceptance in a different way on the end of this distribution. So faith and actual intellectualist arguments of beliefs, or even some aspects of that explanation, are not as compelling for my work, at least. Does that answer?
Someone.
Okay.
We'll continue later.
Well, I can focus on another aspect of it.
Okay, we still have a few minutes. Somebody else?
Hi, and thank you for the very interesting talk. I have a question. If you have encountered, let's say, a concept, but more from the philosophical field, from Paul Ricoeur, because I think that he's one of his most famous books, let's say, it's Symbolism of Evil, and it's quite closely, I would say, related to what you're studying.
Okay.
And maybe I would just briefly ask you like his main thought in this book, and I would maybe ask you like if you think that this would make any sense in context of your research.
Yeah.
So this would be probably on on the scale that you have proposed, like the levels of discussion. That would be probably this representational level, right?
Yeah.
So he was just basically investigating the symbol or the whole symbolism of evil as we know it from our modern, let's say, moral point of view.
Yeah.
As a let's say dichotomy of evil and good, right? Mm-hmm. And he kind of followed this in this kind of more like linguistic research back in time as far as he could through all kind of hermeneutical means, so kind of exegesis of different texts and ethnographical works. And he came to a different points in time where he went through kind of like a preconception of evil that was a sin, like a thinking about the sin, in at least in a Christian culture. And then he went farther and farther and farther until he reached still symbolically related to the concept of evil, the symbol of stain, a kind of like Shakespeare would be describing in a work of Macbeth, when there is a stain on a cloth, and the lady Macbeth is trying to wash it off, but it cannot. So it's kind of like thinking about the contagion, and there is also this symbolical thinking, like the talk we had previously about the contagion, like some kind of virus that is attacking us, and this is something that we just want to get rid of. And I think that also there is a Mary Douglas, when she's writing on taboo, she's basically going into polemics with Paul Ricoeur about his understanding of this, let's say, negative approach to this, to this point of view, that it's just like something that is coming from, so on the lowest level, it would be something that is coming from the outside. The believer thinks there's something coming from the outside and just trying to kind of being afraid of it, or trying to get rid of this thing, whatever it is, and then it somehow, to Ricoeur at least, connects all the way up, let's say, to our conception of evil. And now going through this point of view, maybe when we are thinking about morality and then religion, maybe our conception of morality, like in the sense like good and evil, is too modern, like to maybe try to find it in more, let's say, primitive cultures, because in his study it would be something like, there are some very gradual differences, but at some point it's hard to say whether it's a moral or not moral thing, but somehow it just evolves from something else that is not moral.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, the first chunk of it, like, I'm not opposed in any way to sort of symbolist approaches to religious stuff. I think a lot of it's extremely, extremely useful. And so this idea that we were talking with Conrad earlier is that if there are cultural systems and there's a logic to it, and if you can trace even that logic through time to see how things have evolved, marvelous. but no one, I mean, we don't have good data for it, right? Yeah. But part of the things that frightened me away from the humanities early in my education was this idea that this logic was something that people actually affected individuals' lives. So things are fairly mundane. There are a handful of people who might have these wonderfully rich and elaborate models of symbols and their connections between other aspects of culture and religion. Shamans have remarkably rich worldviews. You ask someone the same question who's not a shaman, they're like, I don't know, like, right? So we have to be careful about like how far this body of information can take us, right? Mm-hmm. But maybe I misunderstood, but I worry also about this sort of, I think it might be called a genealogical fallacy, that like because 200 years ago people had some concept of something, it might have evolved into something else, that they have still maintained the psychological impact that it previously has, or it's just like a little bit more subtle, because I think that's probably false. Mm-hmm. So like I'm trying to think of a good example, but like in Dutch and German and Danish, like the word for squirrel is acorn, which in English is a nut that squirrels eat. Right? At some point, the English screwed that up, right? The connection is there. It's pretty obvious, like it works like that. But now in the future, if it turns out that we start calling acorns oak nuts in English, like I don't have necessarily the same psychological state or salience as these words. My child is growing up in Denmark and they cuss like sailors. So he comes home saying fuck every other word, and like, we don't talk like that in this house, but they talk like that at school, right? And so it's got a completely different psychological valence for him. It's a banal thing that you just say, right? Whereas for me, it's got this sort of offensive valence to it, right? It's not inherent in the word. That's my point. Yeah. And so through time, you can call something anything through time, and it's not necessarily going to evolve in a way that makes it closer to the actual idea. It's not necessarily, words are not necessarily going to evolve in ways that carry that same psychological baggage. So the idea of evil being absent in small-scale societies, depending on what that means, of course, the idea that there are things that are the sort of opposite of what Rappaport might call ultimate sacred postulates. Like, that's the worst thing you could possibly do. That's wicked. Like, the ancestors will punish you for that, whether it's like incest or something, right? If that's what we mean by evil, it's universal. If we're talking about the ubiquity of the concept of evil, of course it's going to be different from what traditional society says. It's concepts of nebulous clouds of information that reduce uncertainty. And it evolves. That's cultural evolution, right? Why it evolves is the question in my view. That's important. But I definitely would worry about some of the conceits of sort of historical symbolist approaches that assume that there's some sort of psychological continuity with concepts like a
chain of.
I think a chain's a nice way to model it, but it's like in the experiments I showed, like if you rip someone off, the model of what God gets angry can shift. It might completely go back to the way it was before, right? But these are semantic clouds, and they evolve through time within individuals, across people through time. So they might not even have a word for it, but they might have a concept for absolutely awful things. I think that's probably ubiquitous. So hope that answers some of it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we are running out of time, so any other questions? We'll have plenty of time today for them. Thank you again very much, Ben, for your talk. Sorry if my English is a bit rough around the edges.